Uh, the next question is from Corrine B. Should students be proficient in using the tables, or is knowing the calculator okay?
This is Darren. My students tend to use the calculator more frequently at this point. I have a few students who prefer the table, and they're certainly welcome to use the table throughout the exam. There might be an occasional question in the multiple choice, for example. We've actually run into one very occasionally in a part of a free response where students felt like looking up something on the table was helpful, but for the most part, I would say the majority of my students are comfortable just using their calculators. What about yours, Josh?
For the most part, yes, certainly with normal distribution questions. Where my students tend to use the table more often than the calculator is when they're trying to get a t-critical value for a confidence interval. They'll often feel better with the table because they could just look for the bottom of the table that gives them like 90%, 95%, and so on with the degrees of freedom. But for the most part on inference stuff now, they're using the test menu, which provides that information for them. So that might be more of a multiple choice type of issue where they might use the t-table for a critical value.
All right. We have 5 more questions. This one should be a quick one. Are mechanical pencils allowed on the exam?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I have students ask me that every year. I'm not sure the concern, but my students use them all the time, and they've never had any trouble.
Good. The next question is from Becky G. As a follow-up to the penmanship question, how closely is syntax and correct use of English graded? I have a large number of English language learners for whom writing explanations is difficult.
So this is Darren. I work at a boarding school, so I have a number of students who are international students, and this is not the AP English exam. We're concerned about students' statistical knowledge and their ability to communicate their statistical understanding. So unless the structure of the writing gets in the way of that objective, the readers are really going to be forgiving with awkward sentence structure or faulty usage. I can't think of too many cases where I've found that students' use of the English language has gotten in the way, very occasionally though. So I hope that was a clear enough answer.
Yes, and I agree.
Okay. The next question is, what is your recommendation regarding pooling? I have gone with the book answer, but then have seen old free response questions that did pooling.
So pooling generally just means combining data to come up with a better estimate for something. And depending on the situation, pooling is appropriate in some cases and not as appropriate in other cases. So for example, when we're doing a 2-sample z-test for a difference in proportions, the null hypothesis typically says that those 2 proportions are equal to each other. And the calculations in a significance test are always based on the assumption that the null hypothesis is true. So we're left with a situation where we have to assume that those proportions are the same, but we don't know the value of either of them. So that's a case where we do pool the proportions or pool the data, do the total number of successes over the total sample sizes to come up with one estimate for the overall population proportion. In the book, we call that the pooled or the combined proportion. In that case, it's actually not optional. That's what the right procedure is. And for instance, the 2-prop-z test on the calculator automatically does that and doesn't ask students whether they want to pool or not. On the other hand, if you're doing a 2-sample t-test for a difference in means, the null hypothesis is that the 2 means are equal, but there's no statement about the standard deviations needing to be equal. So when your calculator asks you whether you want to pool on the 2-sample t-test, it's asking the student whether they want to combine the data to come up with a single estimate for the standard deviation. That requires that additional assumptions are met, and it typically doesn't add much value or much power, I should say, to the procedure. So the AP Stats answer for anything involving the two-sample t test or two-sample t interval, when the calculator asks you to pool, just say no.
The next question is from Dion M. Is there going to be a book map again this year? If so, do you know when it will be available?
So Dion, I asked some people at NCTM about this, and they said essentially, not sure, we'll get back to you. But I'm guessing at this point that if we haven't seen a book map for the free response questions, we probably won't. And I'm guessing the reason why is that, well, first, for those who don't know what the question was about, the last 2 years, they've released a book map of the free response questions, which basically gives kids an idea of what each page is going to look like. It'll have a little box that says question is here, and then a blank space where you can, that's where your answer would go. So kids could feel comfortable about the layout of the exam. But what was pretty obvious to most of us last year, when we saw question 5 on the book map, there was a tiny little bit for a question and then a really long space for an answer. And so we pretty much all knew that was going to be an inference question, requiring the 4-step process. So my guess is that they didn't really think too far ahead on what clues they could be giving with the book map, and have probably stopped that at this point.
The next question is from Julie C. Will students get a deduction if they talk about central limit theorem instead of just using language, large sample size, or does it matter? And what is the cutoff point for N?
This is Darren. We know that students, when they're doing inference about a mean, and they don't know that the population distribution is normal, it's great that they're thinking about the central limit theorem, and that if the sample size is large enough, they're okay to go ahead and perform calculations. As long as students don't start freelancing beyond that, they're probably okay if they just refer to the central limit theorem and the fact that N is large enough. And by large enough, in our text, we use the criterion of N being at least 30. On the AP exam, they usually go quite a bit higher than that, just to be sure that whatever text students are using, the requirements are met. So as long as the student says N is 50, which is greater than or equal to 30, so the central limit theorem applies, no grader is going to object to that. Josh, you agree?
Yeah, I agree. But this is one of those cases where it's possible that saying too much could hurt you. If you use the central limit theorem correctly or refer to it correctly, that's great. But lots of kids will just put the central limit theorem down on any old question, just trying to sound like they know something. And of course, that could end up hurting them.
And the last question that we have is from Lou D. Please comment on the use of bullets in free response questions as compared to full sentences.
Well, I'll go first. This is Darren. I like students using bullets. It helps keep some of my students really well organized. So even within each of the 4 steps of the state plan do and conclude, my students tend to bullet individual parts of those, like test statistic or p-value. The only problem for me is if a question requires students by saying write a few sentences, that's really a case where the bulleted list is going to potentially be problematic. So for the most part, I let students follow their own style, and if the bullets help keep them organized, I'm a fan. And
I would agree as a reader that it's a lot easier to follow the student's work and be able to identify the things that the student is doing correctly if it's well organized. That doesn't necessarily mean bullets, but it does mean well organized. And oftentimes doing it with bullets does help a student organize their response. And so generally that's a good thing.
And one more question just came through from a first-year AP Statistics teacher. Is there any general last-minute advice that we didn't cover on today's webinar?
Not really. I think we hit the main points. I would just try to spend as much time as possible going through recent AP exam questions so students feel real comfortable with how they're written. Looking at the scoring guidelines to see what kind of expectations they have, and then reminding them that getting 50% on the AP exam is a guaranteed 3, and they don't need to stress out if they're not getting perfect scores.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would also add that there's still plenty of time to improve your score if you're a student. I have students who've been working practice questions and making mistakes, and like Josh says, getting a little bit more than 50% correct. But if they can improve just a little bit, they're actually within striking distance of earning a 4. So it's only a little bit of improvement over just a little bit less than a 2-week period.